I called an HVAC technician while my wife was supposedly in Vancouver. 2 hours later, he texted me something that froze the blood in my veins. "Mr. Hoffman, there is a locked door behind your basement storage shelves." "Who is inside?" Confused, I replied. "What door? We do not have any locked rooms down there." His next message made my heart stop. "Sir, I can hear breathing inside, and there are 4 heavy padlocks securing it from the outside." I did not text back. I dialed 911. "Before I take you through the nightmare that my own flesh and blood constructed right beneath my feet, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the darkest secrets are usually kept by the people closest to you. My name is Warren Hoffman. I am 66 years old, and for the past 35 years, I believed I was living the quiet, predictable American dream. I spent decades working hard as an engineer, earning a solid living, and maintaining our 4-bedroom colonial home in the peaceful suburbs of Oak Park, Illinois. My wife Patricia and I had built a life that looked absolutely flawless from the outside. We raised our son Cameron, gave him a debt-free college education, and watched him confidently start his own luxury real estate development firm. But perfection is an illusion. It is a fragile facade meant to hide the rot spreading underneath the floorboards. 6 months ago, Cameron came to me with a generous offer. He claimed he had found traces of asbestos in our basement during a routine structural inspection he did for us as a favor. Being the supposedly caring and responsible son he insisted on handling the abatement process himself. He brought in his own private contractors, sealed off the back half of the basement behind thick plastic tarps, and told me to stay upstairs for my own respiratory safety. A few weeks later, he presented a pristine, newly drywalled storage room. I thanked him, completely oblivious to the horrific fact that my son had just constructed a prison cell inside my own home. The timing seemed coincidental back then, but looking back with the clarity of hindsight, the orchestration was chillingly precise. Right around the time Cameron finished the basement renovation, Patricia's 82-year-old father, Leonard, suffered a severe and sudden decline in his cognitive health. Patricia wept in my arms, telling me that her father needed highly specialized around-the-clock care. She claimed she had found an exclusive world-class memory care clinic in Vancouver, Canada, a facility that cost $12,000 a month. She packed her suitcases and began taking frequent extended trips to Vancouver to manage his care, leaving me alone in the big house for weeks at a time. I trusted her implicitly. I held her while she cried. I believed my son's construction project was an act of pure familial love. That brings us to last Tuesday. The furnace had been making a strange, aggressive rattling noise all week, and with Patricia supposedly away on another 2-week trip to Vancouver, I called Aaron, a local HVAC technician, to take a look. I led him into the basement, offered him a cup of coffee, and went back upstairs to the kitchen to read the morning paper. 2 hours later, that terrifying text message lit up my phone screen. Breathing. 4 padlocks. When I dialed 911, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone to my ear. The dispatcher asked me what the emergency was. I told her I did not know, but that someone was trapped inside the walls of my house. Within 10 minutes, the quiet tranquility of my suburban street was shattered by the wail of sirens. 3 police cruisers aggressively pulled into my driveway, their tires screeching against the pavement. Neighbors peeked out from behind their manicured hedges as officers swarmed my front porch, their hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons. I led them down the wooden stairs to the basement. Aaron, the technician, was standing as far away from the newly built drywall as possible, his face pale and slick with sweat, pointing a shaking finger toward the heavy wooden storage shelves. The officers moved the heavy shelves aside, revealing a thick steel door seamlessly blended into the drywall. Cameron had painted it the exact same color as the surrounding walls to render it invisible. It was secured by 4 heavy-duty industrial-grade padlocks locked from the outside. One of the officers banged his fist heavily against the steel. "Police, is someone in there?" A weak, raspy wheeze answered from the other side. It barely sounded human. It sounded like an animal clinging to its absolute last breath in the dark. The officers did not wait for a key. One of them sprinted up the stairs and returned with a heavy breaching tool from his cruiser. The sound of metal striking metal echoed deafeningly through the basement as they smashed the padlocks one by one, sparks flying in the dim light. With a violent kick, the door swung inward. What poured out of that room was a smell I will never forget for as long as I live. It was the thick, suffocating stench of ammonia decay and profound neglect. The officers instinctively covered their mouths, coughing and gagging, shining their heavy tactical flashlights into the pitch-black space. I stepped forward, peering over their broad shoulders, my mind desperately trying to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. There was no medical clinic in Vancouver. There was no $12,000 a month luxury care. Sitting in the center of that windowless, unventilated concrete box was Leonard, my father-in-law, the man Patricia was supposedly visiting and crying over in Canada. He was sitting in a soiled armchair, shockingly malnourished, his collarbones jutting out sharply from beneath a stained t-shirt. His eyes were wide, vacant, and terrified by the sudden blinding light. But the most horrifying detail was the crude automated mechanism attached to him. My son, the brilliant real estate developer, had rigged a rudimentary automated feeding tube. It was connected to a digital timer dispensing a meager ration of liquid nutrition and water, just enough to keep the old man biologically alive, but barely living. He was sitting in his own filth, abandoned in the dark, treated with less dignity than livestock. My knees gave out completely. I collapsed against the cold basement wall, gasping for air as if I were drowning. My wife was not in Vancouver. She was not sitting tearfully by her father's bedside. She and my son had locked him in a dark hole beneath my feet. They were collecting his massive pension, draining his life savings, and keeping him barely breathing to prolong their financial harvest. The sheer magnitude of their depravity paralyzed my brain. I could not process that the woman I had shared a bed with for 35 years was capable of such monstrous, calculated cruelty. Paramedics rushed past me, pushing a gurney down the narrow basement stairs. They shouted urgent medical codes, stabilizing Leonard frantically, trying to reverse the severe dehydration and prolonged neglect. I stood there trembling uncontrollably, watching them carry the frail, broken old man out of the tomb my own son had built for him. I expected the police to turn to me for answers. I expected them to ask me how this tragedy happened, to take my statement as a horrified and traumatized witness. But that is not how the law works when a hostage is found locked inside your property. Detective Gibson, a tall, imposing man with cold, calculating eyes, stepped out of the hidden room. He pulled a pair of latex gloves off his hands with a loud, aggressive snap. He did not look at me with sympathy or understanding. He looked at me with absolute disgust. "Warren Hoffman," he said, his voice echoing loudly over the chaos of the paramedics and police radios. Before I could even open my mouth to explain that I had no idea this room existed. Gibson lunged forward. He grabbed my arm, spinning me around violently and slamming my chest against the basement wall. "You have the right to remain silent," he recited coldly, pulling my arms forcefully behind my back. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists, biting sharply into my skin. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Wait," I pleaded, my voice cracking with panic. "I did not know. I called you. I am the one who called 911. Gibson leaned in close to my ear, his breath smelling of stale coffee and anger. "Save it for the judge, you sick old man. You are under arrest for elder abuse, aggravated neglect, and false imprisonment." They marched me up my own stairs, through my front door, and out onto my front lawn. The afternoon sun was blindingly bright. The entire neighborhood had gathered on the sidewalks. The people I had known for decades, the neighbors I barbecued with every summer, watched in stunned, horrified silence as I was paraded in handcuffs and shoved roughly into the back of a police cruiser. As the cruiser doors slammed shut, trapping me in the back seat, the reality of my situation crushed the breath out of my lungs. My wife and my son had not just tortured an old man for his money. They had built the perfect crime, and they had set me up to take the fall. The interrogation room was exactly as cold and sterile as you would imagine. The windowless concrete walls seemed to close in on me as I sat shivering in a hard metal chair. My wrists throbbed from the tight handcuffs. The heavy steel door swung open, and Detective Gibson marched inside. He did not sit down. He slammed a massive stack of bank printouts directly onto the metal table between us. The loud crack echoed off the concrete, meant to intimidate me to break whatever resolve I had left. Gibson leaned over the table, placing his face inches from mine. He accused me of bleeding my father-in-law dry. He pointed a thick finger at the documents, claiming that over $4 million had vanished from Leonard S. retirement portfolios over the past 3 years. He painted a picture of a greedy, desperate old man who built a dungeon in his own basement to hide a frail victim while stealing his life savings. I stared at the financial statements scattered across the table. The numbers printed in black ink were staggering. There were wire transfers for $50,000, $100,000, and $200,000, all moving out of Leonard S. accounts into offshore trusts and anonymous corporate holding companies. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as the sheer scale of the deception became clear. Patricia and Cameron had not just hidden Leonard. They had meticulously drained his entire existence, and they had orchestrated it so perfectly that when the police inevitably found him, I would be the only one standing in the house caught red-handed with the locked room and the missing millions. It was a flawless frame job designed by the people I loved most. Gibson slid a heavy plastic desk phone across the table. He told me I had the right to one phone call. He crossed his arms, standing back and watching me closely. He fully expected me to call my wife. He probably had officers ready to trace her location or record my frantic, desperate pleas to her. But I did not call Patricia. I did not call my son. My hands were remarkably steady as I picked up the receiver and dialed a number I had committed to memory over 2 decades ago. I called Vincent Foster. Vincent is not a standard public defender or a typical family lawyer. He is a ruthless, highly feared corporate forensic auditor. We had served in the military together long before he built a lucrative career dismantling corrupt hedge funds and hunting down deeply hidden financial assets. When he answered on the second ring, I did not waste time with pleasantries or panic. I simply told him I was sitting in the Oak Park Police Precinct facing charges of elder abuse and grand larceny, and that my family had built a prison cell in my basement. Vincent did not ask questions. He told me to stay entirely silent and that he was on his way. So I sat in the freezing room for exactly 47 minutes. Gibson tried to interrogate me further, trying to provoke a confession, but I stared blankly at the wall, following Vincent's instructions to the letter. Finally, the heavy metal door was pushed open with commanding force. Vincent Foster strode into the interrogation room, completely ignoring the flustered public defender who was trying to follow him inside. Vincent wore a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. He radiated an aura of absolute control. Gibson immediately stood up, attempting to assert his authority over the interruption, but Vincent cut him off before he could even speak. Vincent opened his briefcase and dropped a sealed blue folder directly onto the scattered bank statements Gibson had used to threaten me. He told the detective to stop looking at the missing money and start looking very closely at the signatures authorizing those massive withdrawals. Vincent pulled out my personal tax returns from the last 10 years and laid them out in a neat row. He systematically dismantled Gibson S.'s entire theory in less than 3 minutes. The documents revealed a critical truth about my life. I have lived entirely and exclusively on a modest fixed union pension since I retired. I have never accessed a single penny of Leonard S. estate. I drive an old truck, I buy my clothes on discount, and my bank accounts have never seen a deposit larger than my monthly pension check. Vincent then pointed a sharp pen at the fraudulent transfer documents. He showed Gibson that every single transaction draining the $4 million estate was authorized exclusively under 2 names. Those names were Patricia Hoffman and Cameron Hoffman. Vincent S.'s voice was calm but laced with lethal precision as he explained the money trail. He showed the detective that the corporate holding accounts receiving the stolen millions did not belong to me. They belonged exclusively to my son A's luxury real estate development firm. Vincent looked Gibson dead in the eyes and explained that if the police wanted the architects of this horrific nightmare, they were currently interrogating the wrong man. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the ultimate scapegoat for a sophisticated, remorseless criminal syndicate operated by my own wife and son. The aggressive atmosphere in the small room shifted instantly. Gibson looked from the undeniable financial proof to my bruised wrists, his hostile posture completely deflating into a quiet, stunned realization. He understood he had made a massive mistake. He had arrested the victim of a frame job. After a tense hour of legal maneuvering and verifying the documents Vincent provided, Gibson agreed to release me on bail. He walked over and unlocked my handcuffs, the heavy metal falling away from my raw skin. However, the detective gave me a stern, cold warning. He told me I was absolutely not allowed to leave the state under any circumstances. I was still technically a person of interest until his department could locate and capture Patricia and Cameron. I nodded slowly, rubbing my wrists, feeling a dark, cold resolve settling deep into my bones. Vincent walked with me out to the front desk of the precinct so I could retrieve my personal belongings. The desk officer handed me a clear plastic bag containing my wallet, my house keys, and my cell phone. I tore the plastic open and pulled out my phone. The device vibrated in my palm. The screen lit up instantly, displaying a new urgent text message. It was from Patricia. My stomach churned as I read her words. Her message stated that Leonard S. Medical Clinic in Vancouver had just raised their monthly rates due to a sudden decline in his cognitive health. She demanded that I go to the bank and wire $50,000 from our joint savings account by tomorrow morning. The text ended with a vicious, manipulative threat. Patricia wrote that if I did not send the money immediately, the luxury clinic would be forced to evict her poor, suffering father and move him to a substandard, overcrowded state facility. I stood frozen in the bustling police precinct, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The absolute audacity and boundless cruelty of her demand washed over me. She was actively using her own father's fake suffering as a weapon to extort the last remaining dollars from my personal savings. She wanted me to feel guilty. She wanted me to panic and send the money to save a man who was already locked in a concrete box beneath my own kitchen. I looked up at Vincent, showing him the screen. A cold, dangerous smile spread across his face. Patricia was sitting somewhere far away, confident in her brilliant deception. She was completely unaware that her father was currently lying in a hospital bed across town, surrounded by armed police officers and trauma doctors. She had no idea that her perfect, monstrous lie had just been completely shattered. She thought she was still pulling the strings, but she did not realize the game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the naive, trusting husband she left behind. I slipped the phone into my pocket, walked out of the precinct doors into the cool afternoon air, and prepared to burn her entire world to the ground. I did not reply to Patricia. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading her extortion attempt one last time, and then I simply slipped the device back into my pocket. Panic is exactly what she expected. Silence was what I would give her. I turned to Vincent as we sat in the leather seats of his sedan, parked just outside the police precinct. I told him we were not going home. We were going to pay a visit to the architect of this entire nightmare. We were going to see my son. Vincent put the car in drive, and we navigated through the afternoon traffic toward the city center. Cameron owned a luxury real estate development firm located in one of the most expensive high-rise glass buildings downtown. It was a monument to his ego, a towering structure of steel and vanity that he loved to flaunt. A few years ago, during a brief period when he was trying to impress me into investing my pension into his business, he had given me a VIP investor access card. He thought it would make me feel important, a pathetic attempt to stroke an old man's ego to get to his wallet. I had tossed that heavy plastic card into the glove compartment of my truck and completely forgotten about it until today. We pulled into the underground parking garage. The air was cool and smelled of damp concrete and expensive exhaust. I retrieved the access card, my hands remarkably steady. I swiped the card against the private elevator sensor. A small green light blinked and the heavy metal doors slid open. Cameron had never deactivated my access. He was so arrogant, so utterly convinced of his own superior intellect, that he never imagined his frail, trusting father would ever have the nerve to step foot in his building uninvited. The elevator shot up to the top floor, opening directly into a vast, empty reception area. The firm was quiet, most of the staff out for the late afternoon. Vincent and I moved silently down the long corridor, our footsteps muffled by the plush, ridiculously expensive carpet. We reached the heavy oak doors of Cameron's corner office. It was not locked. I pushed the door open, stepping into a room that screamed of unearned wealth. There were panoramic views, city skyline, imported Italian leather sofas, and a massive mahogany desk dominating the center of the room. It sickened me to realize that every single item in this room, down to the designer pens on the desk, was paid for by the suffering of an 82-year-old man locked in the dark. Vincent did not waste a single second. He walked straight behind the mahogany desk and woke up the synchronized desktop computer. Cameron was reckless. Like many men who believe they are untouchable, he had left his primary workstation synced to his cloud accounts. Vincent sat down, his fingers flying across the keyboard with the speed and precision of a predator hunting its prey. He bypassed the basic login screens and dug directly into the firm's financial architecture. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, keeping watch on the silent hallway, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. In less than 15 minutes, Vincent found it. He motioned for me to come around the desk. He pointed to a series of hidden ledgers and encrypted spreadsheets. There was no memory care clinic in Vancouver. There was no Canadian medical facility charging $12,000 a month. Vincent traced the digital trail of the money Patricia had been wiring. Every single dollar was being funneled directly into a domestic shell company registered under a fake corporate umbrella. The owners of that shell company were listed clearly on the screen: Cameron Hoffman and his wife, Vanessa. Vincent clicked through the financial records, exposing the rotting core of my son's empire. Cameron's real estate development firm was a complete mirage. His flagship project, a massive luxury condo complex on the waterfront, was failing spectacularly. He was drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt, contractor liens, and defaulted loans. To keep his sinking ship afloat and maintain the illusion of success, he and Patricia had turned Leonard into a captive cash cow. They were systematically laundering Leonard's life savings through the fake medical bills to pay off angry investors and fund Vanessa's lavish lifestyle. The sheer calculated evil of their operation left a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. Suddenly, the sharp, rhythmic click of high heels echoed down the silent hallway. Vincent swiftly minimized the financial windows, restoring the desktop to a blank screen, and stepped away from the desk. The heavy oak door swung wide open. Vanessa walked into the office. My daughter-in-law was dripping in wealth. She wore a tailored designer suit that easily cost more than my first car, carrying a handbag worth a year of my pension, and her wrists glittered with diamond bracelets. Every ounce of her immaculate appearance was bought with the blood and suffering of her own grandfather-in-law. When she saw me standing in the center of the office, she stopped dead in her tracks. For a brief, fleeting second, I saw genuine shock flash across her perfectly contoured face. But it disappeared instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, undisguised contempt. She did not greet me. The sweet, loving, respectful daughter-in-law mask that she had worn for years at family dinners evaporated completely. She stood in the doorway, crossing her arms, her eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits. "What exactly are you doing in my husband's office?" she demanded, her voice dripping with venom and arrogance. "You do not belong here." I forced my shoulders to slump. I let my hands tremble slightly, perfectly, stepping into the role of the confused, helpless old man she believed me to be. I told her I was just looking for Cameron. I stammered, telling her that Patricia had texted me about the clinic raising their rates and that I was deeply worried about the money. Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She walked slowly into the room, looking at me as if I were a piece of garbage that had somehow blown into her pristine sanctuary. She did not offer me a seat. She did not offer comfort. She stepped right up to me, the smell of her expensive perfume suffocating in the tense air. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," she sneered, her voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "Patricia told you to wire $50,000 by tomorrow morning. You are going to go to your little bank and you are going to send that money exactly as you were instructed. Because if you do not, Cameron and I might have to have a very serious conversation about your future." She leaned in closer, her diamond bracelets clinking softly. She casually mentioned that taking care of a big, empty house was becoming too much of a burden for a frail man like me. She threatened that if I became uncooperative, if I started asking too many stupid questions, they would start looking into assisted living options for me as well. She looked me dead in the eyes and promised that they would find a facility far away where no one would ever come to visit me and where I could spend the rest of my pathetic life staring at a blank wall. She was threatening to lock me away just like they had locked Leonard in the basement. She was so blinded by her own greed and absolute confidence that she had no idea she was threatening a man who had already seen the monster behind the curtain. She had no idea that the police had already breached the drywall, that the paramedics had already carried the victim out, and that the trap she was threatening to put me in had already been utterly destroyed. I did not yell. I did not confront her. I swallowed my rage, letting it harden into an icy block of pure resolve. I lowered my head, avoiding her gaze, and promised her in a weak, defeated voice that I would go to the bank first thing in the morning and send the $50,000. Vanessa smiled a cold, triumphant smirk. She turned her back on me, dismissing me completely, and ordered me to get out of her office. I shuffled toward the door, playing the broken, obedient victim perfectly. Vincent followed silently behind me. As I walked out into the carpeted hallway and the heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, I stopped acting. My posture straightened. The trembling in my hands ceased completely. Vanessa thought she had just intimidated a helpless old fool. She did not realize she had just given me the absolute final justification I needed to systematically obliterate her entire life. I kept my eyes pinned to the luxurious carpet of my son's corporate office. I let my shoulders sag heavily, shrinking myself into the physical embodiment of a terrified, defenseless old man. I stammered a pathetic and trembling apology to Vanessa, my voice cracking with manufactured fear. I promised her that I would go to the bank first thing in the morning. I swore that the $50,000 she demanded would be wired immediately to her fake medical clinic. I begged her not to look into assisted living facilities for me, playing the broken, submissive victim so perfectly that she actually scoffed in disgust. She rolled her eyes, turned her back on me, and waved her hand as if dismissing a stray dog. Vincent and I shuffled out of her office like two frightened shadows retreating from a predator. We walked slowly down the plush hallway, keeping the illusion alive just in case she was watching us through the glass partitions. But the absolute second the heavy oak doors of the elevator clicked shut behind us, the illusion vanished completely. I stood up straight. I rolled my shoulders back until my spine popped. My breathing steadied into a calm, controlled rhythm. I looked at Vincent, and without a single word passing between us, the atmosphere shifted. The time for hiding and cowering was officially over. We stepped out into the underground parking garage and got into his sleek sedan. I told him to drive directly to the primary downtown branch of Zenith Wealth Management. As the city blocks rolled by outside the tinted windows, I looked at the bustling streets and thought about the massive secret I had kept hidden from my family for nearly 3 decades. When the police looked at my tax returns earlier that day, they saw exactly what they expected to see. They saw a retired, hard-working engineer surviving on a fixed, modest union pension. That was exactly what Patricia saw when she married me. That was exactly the narrative Cameron grew up believing. It was a flawless financial camouflage I had designed to protect myself from the very greed I was now fighting. What none of them knew was that long before I met Patricia, long before Cameron was even a thought in my mind, I was part of a relentless tech boom in the late 90s. I developed a highly specialized software patent for global commercial logistics. I sold that single patent to an international shipping conglomerate for an absurd, life-altering amount of money. I invested the profits quietly and fiercely, protected my privacy. I placed the vast majority of my wealth into heavily fortified blind trusts managed by elite financial architects. I wanted a normal life. I wanted a family that loved me for who I was, not for a sprawling bank balance. I wanted a wife who stood by me for my character, not my checkbook. My true net worth sits quietly at over $20 million, completely invisible to the greedy parasites currently occupying my home. They thought they were draining a vulnerable old man, but they had absolutely no idea they had picked a fight with a ghost who held more resources than they could ever comprehend. Vincent pulled the car up to the imposing granite columns of the Wealth Management Bank. We walked through the polished brass doors, bypassing the regular teller lines and the standard customer service desks entirely. I approached the private banking concierge and asked to speak directly with Marcus Thorne, the senior wealth manager who exclusively handled my hidden portfolio. Within moments, Marcus stepped out of the restricted access wing and ushered us into his soundproof glass office. I sat down in the plush leather chair and instructed Marcus to initiate a code-red financial freeze across all my exposed joint accounts. Every single shared checking account, savings account, and emergency fund I held publicly with Patricia was to be locked down instantly. I watched the reflection of the computer screen in Marcus's glasses as he typed rapidly. Any debit card with Patricia's name on it was terminated right then and there. Any scheduled wire transfer, including the fake medical bills she expected me to pay, was permanently canceled. Furthermore, I directed Marcus to reinforce the security firewalls on my hidden trusts. I ensured that even if Patricia somehow discovered their existence during her frantic search for cash, she could not touch a single dime without my physical presence, my biometric verification, and a complex series of legal authorizations. It was a digital guillotine dropping swiftly and silently on my family's endless greed. Patricia was now completely and utterly cut off from my everyday money. She would try to buy her morning coffee and find herself holding a worthless piece of plastic. The satisfaction of securing my assets and laying the trap was profound, but it was abruptly and violently shattered. Marcus stopped typing. He stared at his primary monitor, his professional demeanor instantly shifting into a grim, deeply concerned expression. He clicked his mouse a few more times, his brow furrowing as he read a newly generated alert. He looked up at me, his face completely drained of color. He asked me in a tight whisper if I had authorized a massive high-risk transaction against my primary residence earlier this week. I felt a sudden icy drop in the pit of my stomach. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. Our home in Oak Park was completely paid off. We had celebrated burning the mortgage papers years ago. There was no debt attached to that property. Marcus slowly turned his large monitor around to face me. He pointed to a freshly approved digital document that made the air evaporate from my lungs. 3 days ago, while she was supposedly sitting by her dying father's bedside in a Vancouver clinic, Patricia had bypassed our standard checking accounts completely. She had walked into a different branch of this very bank, sat down with a junior loan officer, and taken out a massive home equity line of credit against the total appraised value of our house. She had forged my signature on the complex legal documents with absolute chilling precision. She had withdrawn $400,000 in pure, untraceable cash against the equity of the home I had built with my own hands. The sheer magnitude and audacity of her theft made the room spin. I stared at the forged signature on the bright screen. It was a masterpiece of deception. She had perfectly replicated the exact slant, the pressure, and the loop of my handwriting. She had been practicing this betrayal for months, perfectly preparing to steal the very foundation of my life. Marcus leaned forward across his desk, his voice low and incredibly tense. He explained the catastrophic reality of our new situation. Because the massive line of credit was legally secured against the physical property of my house, the bank now legally held my deed as collateral. Since Patricia had immediately drained the maximum allowable funds in a single massive withdrawal, the account was heavily flagged by the automated fraud department. Marcus warned me that because this was a potentially fraudulent high-risk loan, the bank's corporate security division was already preparing to intervene forcefully. If I could not immediately verify the debt, or if I did not replace the $400,000 within a matter of days, the bank would protect its investment. They would initiate aggressive and immediate foreclosure proceedings. They would legally seize my home and evict me. Patricia had not just stolen cash from a checking account. She had literally stolen the roof over my head to fund Cameron and Vanessa's failing real estate empire. I sat in the silent glass office, the weight of the betrayal crushing down on me. I realized that my wife was much more dangerous and desperate than I ever imagined. She was actively burning our entire life to the ground, and she was perfectly content to leave me to burn in the ashes. Vincent and I left the bank in absolute silence. The cool afternoon air felt heavy in my lungs as we walked back to his car. My own wife had forged my signature to steal $400,000 against the house I had spent decades turning into a home. She was not just a greedy spouse. She was a calculated predator. We got back into the sedan, and I told Vincent we needed to find exactly where Patricia was hiding right now. I refused to believe she was sitting in a Canadian medical clinic holding her father's hand. Vincent nodded and picked up his phone. He did not call a standard local detective. He called an elite private investigator, a man who specialized in tracking corporate fugitives and uncovering heavily guarded offshore assets. We gave him Patricia's name, her cell phone number, and the routing details of the forged credit line. The investigator promised us definitive answers within 3 hours. Those 3 hours were the longest and most agonizing of my entire life. Vincent and I sat in a quiet coffee shop across from the police precinct waiting for the call that would confirm the depth of my family's betrayal. I stared down into my black coffee, replaying the last 35 years of my marriage in my mind. I tried to find the exact moment the woman I loved turned into a monster. Did she always look at me as a walking bank account? Had our entire life together been nothing but a patient, calculating waiting game for her to finally steal my security? I realized that my family had not just broken my heart. They had insulted my intelligence. They had assumed I would simply roll over, accept the blame for their monstrous crimes, and quietly wither away in a prison cell. They were profoundly wrong. Exactly 3 hours later, Vincent's secure phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted file. The private investigator had hit a goldmine. He did not just find a geographical location. He had successfully tapped into a live security feed from a luxury resort and resorted to immediate boots on the ground surveillance. Vincent opened the video file on his laptop, adjusted the brightness, and turned the screen toward me. My wife was not in Vancouver. She was thousands of miles away from any medical facility. Patricia was sitting comfortably at a velvet-covered table inside a heavily guarded VIP high-roller suite in Las Vegas, Nevada. The high-definition surveillance photographs showed her laughing brightly, holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. Sitting right next to her at the exclusive baccarat table were my son Cameron and his wife Vanessa. They were completely surrounded by towering stacks of high-denomination casino chips. They were aggressively and joyfully gambling away the $400,000 they had stolen from the equity of my home. The sheer visual contrast made me physically sick to my stomach. I looked at the image of Patricia draped in a brand-new silk evening gown, throwing $100 chips onto the green felt table with absolute reckless joy. I thought about her father, Leonard. I thought about the frail, starving old man sitting in a pitch-black concrete cell beneath my kitchen, strapped to a crude automated feeding tube and left to rot in his own waste. My wife was throwing away her father's dignity and my financial security on casino games and luxury liquor. They were actively celebrating their successful heist. They were toasting to my impending financial and legal ruin. Staring at that glowing laptop screen, the last remaining shred of love or loyalty I held for my family evaporated completely. It burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and absolute clarity. I looked up at Vincent, and my voice did not tremble in the slightest. I told him that I wanted my entire family systematically dismantled. I instructed him to begin drafting the most aggressive legal documents his corporate firm had ever produced. First, I ordered immediate, uncompromising divorce papers for Patricia, citing egregious financial fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. I wanted her entirely stripped of any claim to my name, my pension, or my hidden assets. Second, I told Vincent to draft immediate property eviction notices for Cameron and Vanessa. They were living in a luxury condominium that I now knew was funded by stolen money laundered through their fake shell companies. I wanted them thrown out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Finally, and most importantly, I instructed him to prepare comprehensive federal fraud indictments. I wanted every forged signature, every laundered dollar, and every fake medical bill packaged and handed directly to the federal authorities. My family had proven themselves to be a coordinated, remorseless criminal syndicate. They operated without a single ounce of empathy or human decency. I was going to ensure that they faced the absolute maximum penalty the justice system could possibly deliver. Vincent smiled a grim, highly satisfied smile and immediately began typing out the dense legal framework for their absolute destruction. As Vincent was furiously drafting the federal indictments on his laptop, my cell phone suddenly began to vibrate violently on the table. The screen lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed Patricia's name. A surge of pure adrenaline rushed through my veins. She was calling me from a VIP casino suite in Las Vegas, surrounded by stolen money and her criminal accomplices, completely unaware that I was watching her every move. I motioned for Vincent to remain completely silent. I took a deep breath, perfectly masking the cold fury burning in my chest, and pressed the answer button. Warren, her voice wailed loudly through the phone speaker. She was sobbing hysterically. Her cries sounded so incredibly genuine, so perfectly saturated with grief and desperate sadness. "Warren, it is my dad. It is Leonard. The doctors just came into the room. He passed away, Warren. He just slipped away peacefully in his sleep." I sat in the quiet coffee shop, listening to my wife deliver the most repulsive, sociopathic lie a human being could possibly construct. She was actively pretending to stand beside her dead father's hospital bed in Canada while actually sitting at a gambling table in Nevada. She was using her own father's fictional death to manipulate my emotions. I forced my voice to sound shocked and deeply devastated. I asked her what had happened, playing the role of the grieving, supportive husband who suspected absolutely nothing. Patricia sniffled loudly into the phone, continuing her masterclass in cruel deception. She claimed that the luxury clinic in Vancouver was demanding immediate payment to legally release his remains. She told me that because he was an international patient, the Canadian medical authorities required an immediate, untraceable cryptocurrency transfer of $20,000 for the emergency international repatriation of his body. She begged me to log into our bank account, purchase the digital currency, and send it to a specific encrypted wallet by midnight. She cried that she could not bear the thought of her father's body being held in a cold foreign morgue simply because we lacked the funds. The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She had already stolen $400,000 from my home equity. She had already drained her father's $4 million estate. And yet, sitting in a luxury casino, she was still trying to wring another $20,000 out of my personal savings using a fake digital wallet to ensure the money could never be traced by the police. She thought I was a pathetic, gullible old fool who would blindly send his life savings to comfort his grieving wife. I held the phone to my ear, listening to her fake sobs echoing against the background noise of what she claimed was a busy hospital corridor. But what I now knew was the ambient sound of a bustling Las Vegas casino floor. I told her to stay strong. I told her that I loved her and that I would handle the financial arrangements immediately to bring her father home. I hung up the phone and looked across the table at Vincent. The trap was fully set. Patricia believed she had won. She had absolutely no idea that the police had already rescued her father, that her financial empire was permanently frozen, and that her inevitable destruction was already in motion. I promised my wife I would send the $20,000 to bring her father home. I injected just the right amount of grief and panic into my voice to make her believe I was rushing to the bank. Then I ended the call and slid my phone into my jacket pocket. I did not go to the bank. I left Vincent at the coffee shop to finish drafting the federal indictments, and I drove my truck straight to the county hospital. The evening sky was turning a bruised purple as I navigated the quiet suburban streets. My mind was moving with absolute clarity. Patricia thought she had manipulated a grieving husband, but she had only confirmed her own monstrous nature. She was sitting in a luxury casino gambling away my home equity while trying to extort my savings over a fake medical emergency. I was going to make sure she lost absolutely everything. I parked at the hospital and took the elevator up to the secure medical wing. Detective Gibson had placed a uniformed police officer outside room 412. The officer recognized me from the chaotic scene at my house earlier that day. He nodded silently and opened the heavy wooden door. I stepped inside the sterile hospital room, and the sight before me stopped my breath. Just a few hours ago, I had watched paramedics carry a frail and dying skeleton out of a concrete tomb in my basement. The man lying in the hospital bed was still incredibly weak, but the transformation was profound. Intravenous fluids and proper nutrition had already begun to reverse the severe dehydration. The hollow and terrified look in his eyes was gone. Leonard was sitting up slightly against the pillows. He looked at me, and for the first time in over a year, his eyes were completely sharp and intensely lucid. The fake dementia that Patricia and Cameron had used to justify locking him away was nothing but severe malnutrition and forced isolation. Given a safe environment and actual medical care, the 82-year-old man was fully present. I walked over to the edge of his bed and took his trembling hand. I expected him to be broken and consumed by the trauma of being held captive by his own flesh and blood. Instead, Leonard looked at me with a fierce and burning anger. He did not cry. He squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. He told me he knew exactly what day it was, and he knew exactly where he had been. He remembered the darkness of the basement. He remembered Cameron securing the padlocks. He remembered his own daughter leaving him there to rot while she stole his money. Leonard asked me to close the door to the hallway. He looked around the room to ensure we were completely alone. Then he dropped a legal bombshell that completely altered the battlefield. Leonard told me that he had never trusted his daughter or my son. 5 years ago, long before his physical health began to decline, he noticed Patricia asking far too many questions about his retirement portfolios. He caught Cameron snooping through his private financial filing cabinets during a Thanksgiving dinner. Leonard knew the greed was festering inside them. He knew they were quietly waiting like vultures to claim his $4 million estate. So Leonard took preemptive action. He told me that 5 years ago he secretly hired an independent estate attorney. He drafted a comprehensive and ironclad and entirely irrevocable medical and financial power of attorney. He did not name his daughter as his proxy. He did not name his grandson. He specifically named me, Warren Hoffman, as the sole and absolute legal authority over his life and his medical decisions and his entire financial portfolio. He trusted me because he knew I lived a modest and honest life. Leonard explained that he had kept the original documents locked in a safe deposit box at his local bank. But when Cameron and Patricia ambushed him and dragged him out of his own home under the guise of taking him to a Canadian medical clinic, Patricia had illegally seized his keys. She found the power of attorney documents and deliberately suppressed them. She hid the legal truth so she could unlawfully assume control of his money. Leonard looked at me and said the documents were still legally binding. The state registry had digital copies. With a single phone call, I could instantly strip Patricia and Cameron of every ounce of authority they claimed to hold over his life and his wealth. I was not just a concerned son-in-law. Under the eyes of the law, I was the absolute guardian of his estate, and I had the power to destroy their entire financial foundation. A sudden and sharp knock on the door broke our conversation. A senior hospital administrator stepped into the room. Her face was pale, and she clutched a medical clipboard tightly against her chest. She looked nervously at the uniformed police officer standing in the hallway and then turned her attention to me. She asked if I was Warren Hoffman. I nodded, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline tightening my muscles. She stepped closer and lowered her voice to a tense whisper. She informed me that the hospital front desk had just received a highly aggressive phone call. The caller identified himself as Dr. Cameron Hoffman. My son had contacted the hospital demanding the immediate and unlogged transfer of his grandfather to a private and off-the-grid hospice facility across state lines. Cameron had aggressively invoked his supposed status as next of kin and threatened to sue the hospital for medical kidnapping if they did not release the patient to his private transport team immediately. The chilling reality of the situation washed over me. Cameron and Patricia were still in Las Vegas, but Cameron was not celebrating anymore. He had somehow realized that the basement cell had been breached. Perhaps he had a hidden security camera in the garage, or perhaps one of his shady contractors had driven by my house and seen the police tape. Regardless of how he found out, Cameron knew the police had rescued Leonard. He knew his entire criminal empire was seconds away from completely collapsing. He was making a desperate and terrifying final move. By ordering an unlogged medical transfer, Cameron was trying to legally abduct the primary victim and the sole witness to his crimes. He wanted to snatch Leonard out of the safety of the hospital and bury him in a remote and unregulated hospice facility where he could finally finish the job. He was trying to erase the evidence before the federal indictments could be filed. He was sending a fake transport team right now to steal his grandfather away in the dead of night. I looked at the hospital administrator. I did not panic. I stood up tall and channeled the immense legal power Leonard had just granted me. I told her calmly and definitively that the man on the phone was not a medical doctor. I told her he was a fugitive currently under federal investigation for elder abuse and attempted murder. I instructed her to lock down the entire hospital wing and deny any transfer requests. I explained that I was the sole legal proxy for the patient and that we were about to prepare a very special welcome for whoever my son sent to collect his victim. The trap was ready to snap shut, and Cameron was walking right into it. I did not hesitate for a single second after the hospital administrator left Leonard's room. I immediately pulled out my phone and dialed Detective Gibson. When he answered, his voice was sharp and professional, but I cut through all the standard formalities. I told him that my son had just tried to order an unlogged medical transfer for my father-in-law. I explained that Cameron had somehow realized the basement had been breached by the authorities and was currently sending a private transport team to abduct our only witness. Gibson did not waste time asking unnecessary questions. He grasped the terrifying reality of the immediate situation instantly. He ordered me to stay exactly where I was and told me he was mobilizing a tactical unit to secure the hospital perimeter. Within 10 minutes, Gibson arrived at the secure ward with 4 heavily armed undercover officers. We moved swiftly down to the lowest level of the massive hospital building, completely bypassing the busy emergency room and the main public lobby. Our destination was the underground loading dock. This was the only entrance large enough and discreet enough for an unofficial medical transport vehicle to access without drawing attention from the regular hospital staff. The atmosphere down in the concrete basement was heavy and suffocating. The cold air smelled strongly of diesel fumes, damp asphalt, and stale industrial cleaner. Flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows against the thick gray walls. Gibson instructed his men to take strategic positions behind concrete support pillars and large wooden medical supply crates. I stood right beside Gibson in the deepest shadows of the loading bay. He had tried to insist that I wait upstairs in a secure administrative office, but I completely refused his request. I needed to see the faces of the men my son had hired to finish his dirty work. I needed to witness the exact moment my family's criminal empire began to collapse under the weight of the law. I thought about the boy I had raised. I thought about teaching Cameron how to ride a bicycle in our driveway. I could not reconcile that innocent child with the ruthless, calculating monster who was now dispatching hired thugs to kidnap his own grandfather. We waited in absolute silence for 22 agonizing minutes. Every distant siren out on the street or sudden rattle of the hospital ventilation system made the muscles in my back tighten with anticipation. I kept my breathing slow and shallow, channeling all my fear and betrayal into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I pictured Cameron sitting in a luxury casino suite in Las Vegas, desperately trying to coordinate a kidnapping from thousands of miles away. He truly thought he was an untouchable mastermind playing a brilliant game of chess. He did not realize that the board had already been destroyed. Suddenly, the heavy metal security gate at the top of the concrete ramp began to roll upward with a loud mechanical grinding noise. A vehicle was descending slowly into the underground dock. It was not an official hospital ambulance. It was a completely unmarked heavy-duty white transport van. There were no medical insignias on the doors, no emergency light bars on the roof, and no license plates visible on the front bumper. The van rolled down the steep ramp and parked aggressively near the service elevators. The large engine rumbled loudly before being suddenly killed. 2 men stepped out of the front seats, and the doors slammed shut, echoing loudly in the concrete cavern. They did not wear scrubs or standard paramedic uniforms. They wore dark tactical clothing, and they moved with the heavy, cautious steps of hired muscle. One of the men pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his dark jacket pocket and looked directly toward the service elevator. He fully expected to walk upstairs, flash a fake document, and simply wheel a frail old man out into the cold night without any resistance. They did not even make it 3 steps away from their vehicle. Detective Gibson stepped out from behind a large concrete pillar, raising his gold badge directly into the harsh overhead light. His commanding voice echoed like a crack of thunder through the empty loading dock. He ordered the men to freeze and to put their hands exactly where he could see them. Before the hired thugs could even process what was happening, the 4 undercover officers swarmed the white van from every possible angle. The tactical takedown was incredibly swift and utterly merciless. The officers slammed the 2 men violently against the cold metal side of the white van, kicking their legs apart and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around their wrists. The men shouted loudly in panic, completely blindsided by the sudden ambush. They had expected to intimidate a few tired night shift nurses and snatch a helpless, sedated patient. They never anticipated walking directly into a heavily armed police sting operation. Gibson did not drag them to an interrogation room at the precinct. He interrogated them right there in the damp, echoing parking garage. He pressed his forearm aggressively against the neck of the driver, pinning him tightly against the side of the van. Gibson demanded to know exactly who sent them and exactly what their orders were regarding the patient in room 412. The driver, terrified by the immediate threat of federal prison and staring into the eyes of a furious detective, cracked under the intense pressure in less than 60 seconds. He frantically confessed everything, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. He told the detective that a man named Cameron had contacted their boss earlier that evening. Cameron had paid them $10,000 in untraceable cash for a highly illegal rush job, but the most horrifying detail was the true nature of their assignment. They were not hired to transfer Leonard to a safer medical facility or a private hospice. The driver, sweating heavily and shaking against the side of the van, admitted their specific instructions were to collect the old man, drive him across the state line, and drop him inside an abandoned condemned motel deep in the desert. They were explicitly told to take away his wheelchair, confiscate all his personal identification, and leave him alone on the floor of an empty room to quietly die of exposure and starvation. The air in the loading dock seemed to freeze solid around me. The sheer, calculated evil of my son's command was almost impossible to process. He was not just trying to hide evidence of his financial crimes. He was actively executing a premeditated murder. Gibson looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and sheer professional fury. He turned back to the driver and formally advised him that the charges against him and his employer had just escalated drastically. They were no longer simply looking at elder abuse or medical fraud. They were now officially under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. As the officers dragged the two hired fixers away toward the waiting police cruisers, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my jacket pocket. I pulled the device out and looked at the brightly illuminated screen. It was a new text message from my wife. After orchestrating the robbery of my home equity, after leaving her own father to rot in a dark basement, and after demanding $20,000 for a fake international funeral, Patricia was still completely committed to her sociopathic performance. I read the message and a bitter, hollow laugh escaped my chest. Patricia wrote that she was flying home tonight with her father's ashes. She instructed me to prepare the large guest suite on the first floor because Cameron and Vanessa were flying back with her. She ended the text by saying that we all needed to stick together and support each other through this terrible, heartbreaking family tragedy. I stared at the screen, letting the absolute absurdity of her words wash over me completely. She was flying home with an urn full of fake ashes, expecting to walk into a house of genuine mourning. She believed that she had successfully eliminated her father, stolen my wealth, and secured her financial future permanently. She fully expected me to open the front door, embrace her with tears in my eyes, and comfort the very people who were actively trying to destroy my life. They were coming back to my house tonight, completely confident in their monstrous victory. They were returning to move into my home, take over my property, and finish draining my estate. They had no idea that their hired killers were currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser. They had no idea that Leonard was awake, lucid, and legally protected by a hidden power of attorney. And they certainly had no idea that the grieving, naive husband they expected to easily manipulate had already built a financial and legal trap so devastating that it would completely obliterate their entire existence. I did not text her back. I simply locked my phone, looked at Detective Gibson, and told him that my family was coming home and we needed to prepare the perfect welcome. I drove back to my house, leaving Detective Gibson and his team at the hospital to handle the aftermath of the loading dock ambush. The suburban streets were incredibly quiet and draped in the deep shadows of the late evening. When I walked through my front door, the silence of the house hit me differently than it ever had before. It no longer felt like a warm sanctuary or a place of comfort. It felt like a crime scene waiting to be processed. I did not sit down to rest. I did not take off my coat. I walked straight upstairs into the sprawling master bedroom I had shared with Patricia for over 3 decades. I pulled a roll of heavy black industrial trash bags from the hallway closet, and I went directly to work. I moved with a cold, mechanical precision that completely surprised me. I did not shed a single tear as I opened her massive walk-in closet. I grabbed handfuls of her expensive silk blouses, designer dresses, and tailored business suits and shoved them unceremoniously into the black plastic bags. I emptied her polished mahogany vanity, tossing her expensive perfumes, diamond earrings, and imported cosmetics into the trash like they were nothing but common debris. Every necklace I threw away felt like I was physically dismantling the lie she had built around me. I dragged bag after heavy bag down the stairs and stacked them in the cold, damp corner of the garage, right next to the oil stains and my old lawnmower. I erased her entire existence from the private spaces of my home in less than 2 hours. But I was incredibly careful with the common areas. I left her favorite decorative throw pillows exactly where she liked them on the living room sofa. I left the expensive silver-framed wedding photo resting perfectly on the fireplace mantel. I left just enough superficial visual evidence in the main living areas to make the environment look absolutely untouched. The stage had to be set flawlessly. The illusion of safety had to be completely maintained for the rats to comfortably walk into the trap. I even fluffed the cushions and turned on the warm ambient floor lamps, ensuring the room radiated the exact welcoming warmth they expected to conquer. I walked into the kitchen and washed my hands methodically, watching the soapy water spiral down the drain, washing away the absolute last remnants of my naive past. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy crunch of gravel in the driveway signaled their arrival. I stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the granite countertop, taking one final deep breath to lock my rage away in a dark vault deep inside my chest. The front door swung open slowly. The heavy thud of expensive leather shoes echoed in the foyer. I walked out to greet them, and the sight before me was an absolute masterclass in sociopathic theater. Patricia Cameron and Vanessa stood in the entryway, dressed in immaculate pitch-black mourning clothes. They looked like they had just walked off the set of a high-budget funeral movie. Patricia was weeping softly, holding an expensive-looking, polished mahogany urn tightly against her chest. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes trembling violently, as if the sheer weight of her grief was too heavy to carry. "Oh, Warren," she sobbed dramatically, rushing forward and burying her wet face into my shoulder. "My poor dad, he is really gone." I wrapped my arms around the woman who had forged my signature and left her father to rot in my basement. I stroked her hair and whispered comforting words, playing the role of the devastated, fiercely supportive husband without missing a single beat. I told her that she was home now and that she was finally safe. I felt the smooth, cold wood of the urn pressing against my chest, knowing fully well it was filled with nothing but cheap gravel or cat litter. Cameron stepped forward, placing a heavy, supportive hand on my shoulder, putting on his very best grieving son face. "It has been a brutal day, Dad," he murmured, shaking his head mournfully. "But we are here for you. We need to stick together as a family right now more than ever." I looked at the man who had hired thugs to kidnap and murder his own grandfather just hours ago. I nodded solemnly, telling him how incredibly proud I was to have him by my side. Vanessa offered a quiet, tragic smile, holding onto Cameron's arm like the perfect, supportive wife dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a silk tissue. I led the grieving actors into the pristine, untouched living room. Patricia carefully placed the polished mahogany urn on the absolute center of the glass coffee table. She stroked the smooth wood with a trembling hand, putting on a sickening display of daughterly devotion. Vanessa sat down next to her, offering a perfectly timed, sympathetic sigh. I walked over to the liquor cabinet and pulled out an expensive bottle of dark red wine and 4 crystal glasses. I poured the dark liquid methodically, handing each of them a glass. We raised our glasses in a silent, somber toast to Leonard. As I watched them drink my expensive wine sitting comfortably on my furniture, I marveled at their absolute boundless arrogance. They were so drunk on their own perceived brilliance that they did not notice the slight empty echo in the house, or the fact that not a single piece of Patricia's luggage was visible anywhere in the foyer. They settled deeply into the plush cushions, completely confident that their horrific crimes were buried forever, and that their ultimate financial harvest was finally ready to be reaped. We sat in the quiet living room for about 20 minutes, listening to Patricia recount fabricated, highly detailed stories about Leonard's peaceful final moments in the fake Canadian clinic. She described how he held her hand and smiled before slipping away. I nodded slowly and held her hand, playing the gullible fool flawlessly. Then Cameron cleared his throat, shifting the atmosphere in the room from mourning to aggressive business. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured concern. "Dad," he began, his voice thick with fake hesitation. "There is a very serious legal situation we need to discuss immediately concerning Grandpa's medical bills in Vancouver." Patricia let out a perfectly timed whimper, hiding her face in her hands to avoid looking at me. Cameron explained that international medical care was incredibly complicated and ruthless. He claimed that because Patricia had rushed to get Leonard the best possible care, she had accidentally signed aggressive financial liability waivers. He told me that Canadian medical debt collectors were already circling like vultures, preparing to seize cross-border assets to cover the massive outstanding clinic fees, which totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then Cameron reached into his tailored black jacket and pulled out a thick, stapled legal document. He slid it slowly across the glass coffee table right next to the fake urn. It was a legally binding deed transfer for my house. He looked me dead in the eyes and told me that the debt collectors could legally seize the entire equity in our home to pay for Leonard's fictional treatments. But he had a brilliant solution to save us. He insisted that if I signed the house over to his corporate real estate firm right now tonight, he could hide the property behind his corporate shield. He promised he was just trying to protect my assets from being seized by foreign creditors. He held out an expensive silver pen, urging me to sign away my home immediately to save the family from absolute financial ruin. The sheer audacity of his demand was breathtaking. My son was sitting in my living room sipping my wine, mourning a man he thought he had murdered and aggressively attempting to steal the absolute last physical asset I possessed right to my face. I looked down at the heavy silver pen resting on the flawless glass surface of the coffee table. The polished metal reflected the warm ambient light of my living room, but all I felt was the icy chill of absolute betrayal. My son was sitting across from me holding a fraudulent document that would strip me of the very home I had raised him in. He actually believed he was outsmarting me. He thought the panic in my eyes was genuine fear of Canadian medical debt collectors coming to seize our assets. He had no idea it was actually the massive, suffocating effort of holding back my own pure rage. I slowly reached out and picked up the pen. It felt incredibly heavy, a physical manifestation of the monstrous lies hanging in the air between us. I let my hand shake just enough to sell the performance of a terrified, desperate old man backed into a corner. I looked at Cameron, asking him in a frail, broken whisper if he was absolutely sure this was the only way to save our family from financial ruin. He nodded with profound, manufactured solemnity, assuring me that his corporate lawyers would build an impenetrable fortress around our properties. I lowered the pen to the thick, stapled paper. What Cameron did not know was that 30 years ago, during the height of my corporate software career, my friend and forensic auditor Vincent Foster had forced me to establish a brilliant legal contingency plan. We had created a highly specific, legally documented duress signature. It was a subtle but undeniable variation of my handwriting, purposely misspelled with a looped middle initial and a disconnected final letter registered exclusively with my attorneys to invalidate any contract signed under extortion or threat. I dragged the silver tip of the pen across the dotted line, deliberately executing the flawed signature with practiced, invisible precision. I handed the clipboard back to my son, legally sealing his ultimate fate with a single stroke of ink. The absolute second the pen lifted from the paper, the atmosphere in the living room shattered completely. The somber, grieving tension that had suffocated the house evaporated so fast, it left a cold vacuum in its wake. Cameron did not gently take the clipboard from my hands to offer a comforting word. He snatched it aggressively, his fingers gripping the paper like a starving animal claiming a fresh kill. He looked down at the signature, his eyes darting eagerly across the blue ink to verify the transfer was complete. Because he was so blinded by his own towering arrogance and desperate greed, he did not notice the deliberate misspelling. He only saw his own magnificent victory. The heavy mask of the morning supportive sun melted off his face in an instant, replaced by a smug, predatory smirk that made my stomach churn. He leaned back into the sofa, tossing the expensive silver pen carelessly onto the glass table, letting out a long breath of absolute relief. Beside him, Vanessa underwent a similarly grotesque transformation. The sympathetic tissue-dabbing daughter-in-law vanished into thin air. She uncrossed her legs, let out a loud, genuine laugh, and began looking around my living room with undisguised, mocking contempt. Her eyes landed on the worn, comfortable fabric armchair I was sitting in, the very chair I had rested in every evening for 2 decades after long days of hard work. She pointed a manicured finger directly at me and scoffed loudly. She announced to the entire room that the very first thing they were going to do tomorrow morning was drag that hideous, depressing piece of garbage out to the curb and set it on fire. She confidently stated that an imported Italian leather sectional was already on hold at a luxury boutique downtown, and that it would finally bring some much-needed class to this outdated tomb of a house. They were openly discussing the lavish renovation of my home, while I was still sitting in it, completely discarding the illusion that they were doing this to protect my assets. I turned my gaze toward my wife, expecting her to at least maintain the facade of a grieving widow for the remainder of the evening. But Patricia had already moved on to the next phase of her sociopathic plan. The fake tears that had streamed down her face just minutes prior were completely gone, wiped away, leaving dry, calculating, and ruthless eyes. She sat up perfectly straight, her posture rigid and authoritative, practically glowing with the thrill of her stolen wealth. She did not offer me a comforting embrace or a single word of gratitude for supposedly saving us from her father's fictional medical debt. Instead, she looked at me with the cold, sterile efficiency of a prison warden managing a worthless inmate. She stated in a flat, emotionless tone that since the property was now legally transitioning to Cameron's corporate portfolio, there were going to be some immediate and non-negotiable logistical changes regarding the living arrangements in the house. She casually informed me that Cameron and Vanessa would be moving out of their luxury condo and taking over the primary master bedroom upstairs starting tonight. I stared at her perfectly playing the bewildered, heartbroken husband and asked her in a trembling whisper where exactly she expected me to sleep. Patricia did not even blink. She looked right through me and announced that they were relocating me to the basement storage room immediately. She used a tone dripping with fake condescending pity, claiming that my knees were getting far too frail to safely navigate the staircase every day. She argued that the basement was practically isolated and perfectly suited for my rapidly declining physical condition. The sheer breathtaking cruelty of her statement echoed endlessly through the silent house. My own wife, sitting right next to the fake wooden urn containing the imaginary ashes of her father, was officially banishing me to the exact same underground concrete cell where they had actively tortured and starved him. She was effectively telling me that my usefulness as a human being had expired, and I was now nothing more than an inconvenient object to be locked away in the dark until I died. I looked at the three of them sitting comfortably on my sofa, practically vibrating with triumphant malice. They fully believed they had won the ultimate prize. They fully believed they had successfully stolen my home, secured their fraudulent financial future, and condemned me to a silent, miserable end beneath the floorboards. I slowly placed my hands on the worn fabric armrests of my chair, taking one final deep breath, fully preparing to deliver the devastating reality check that would absolutely annihilate their entire existence. I did not tremble as I stood up from the worn fabric armchair. The frail, exhausted posture I had meticulously carried all evening vanished in a single instant. I planted my feet firmly on the hardwood floor and straightened my spine, looking down at the three people sitting comfortably on my sofa. They were so busy congratulating themselves on their perceived victory that they did not immediately notice the dramatic physical shift in my presence. I looked at Cameron, who was still lounging carelessly, with his legs crossed, staring at the fraudulent deed transfer, like it was a winning lottery ticket. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripped of all the fake panic and desperation I had manufactured just minutes before. I looked my son directly in his eyes and asked him a very simple and practical question about his new living arrangements for me. I asked him if the basement storage room was actually safe for human habitation. I asked if it was properly ventilated, and if the air quality was suitable for a man of my advanced age to live in permanently down in the dark. Cameron let out a loud, condescending sigh, as if my basic concern for my own physical survival was a ridiculous and annoying burden on his patience. He leaned back heavily against the plush cushions and folded his hands behind his head, looking up at me with a smirk that radiated absolute bottomless vanity. He proudly assured me that the basement was in absolutely perfect condition. He explicitly bragged about the extensive renovations he had completed 6 months ago, claiming he had personally overseen the installation of top-tier ventilation systems. He boasted with chilling enthusiasm about the custom drywall he had put in and the heavy-duty professional-grade soundproofing materials he had used to ensure complete privacy. He actually smiled a wide, beaming smile as he told me that the soundproofing was so advanced that not a single noise from the basement would ever disturb them while they slept upstairs. He was openly gloating about the acoustic isolation of the concrete cell he had built to slowly torture his grandfather. Vanessa chimed in with a cruel, mocking laugh, telling me I should be incredibly grateful that her busy husband had spent so much of his valuable time making a dark hole comfortable enough for me to sleep in. The sheer psychopathic pride they both took in their architectural death trap was truly staggering. They thought they were being incredibly clever, hiding their sinister threats behind casual construction terminology. I nodded slowly, absorbing every single monstrous word of my son's arrogant confession. I told him that I was very glad to hear about the high quality of his construction work because I wanted to be absolutely certain of the exact conditions down there. I slowly raised my left hand and reached toward the sleek, modern smartwatch secured around my wrist. Patricia finally seemed to notice that my tone had changed entirely. Her eyes narrowed and she sat up slightly, her gaze dropping to my hands with a flicker of sudden suspicion. I did not say another word to them. I simply tapped a small application icon on the glowing glass screen of my watch. Above the fireplace mantel, the massive flat-screen television that had been quietly broadcasting the evening news suddenly went completely black. The abrupt and total silence in the living room was jarring. The three of them looked up at the blank television screen with mild annoyance, assuming there was a simple power glitch or a lost cable signal. Then the large screen flickered brightly and illuminated the dim living room with a crisp, high-definition live security feed. The television displayed a perfectly clear, brightly lit view of my own basement. It was a live feed from a hidden tactical camera Vincent and I had installed just a few hours earlier. Cameron stared at the massive screen, his arrogant smirk slowly melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. The image broadcast in front of them was undeniable. The camera was pointed directly at the newly built drywall and the heavy steel door he had hidden so perfectly. But the door was no longer a seamless secret. It was completely, violently breached. The 4 heavy-duty industrial padlocks he had installed to keep Leonard trapped inside were shattered and scattered across the gray concrete floor like broken teeth. Brilliant yellow police tape was stretched aggressively back and forth across the open doorway, forming a bright, undeniable web of criminal quarantine. Inside the dark cell, the bright, rapid flashes of forensic cameras illuminated the stark, horrific reality of the hidden room. 3 police technicians dressed in full white protective suits were actively dusting the heavy steel doorframe for fingerprints and carefully collecting the crude automated feeding tubes my son had engineered, sealing them into clear plastic evidence bags. It took exactly 5 agonizing seconds for the monumental reality of the image to penetrate their minds. I watched the exact moment the absolute destruction of their lives registered in Patricia S.'s eyes. All the blood completely drained from her face, leaving her skin looking like damp gray ash. The color simply vanished, leaving behind a terrified, hollow shell of a woman. The muscles in her hands went completely slack, failing her entirely. The expensive crystal wine glass she was holding slipped through her paralyzed fingers and crashed against the hardwood floor, shattering into 100 glittering, jagged pieces. The sharp, explosive sound of the breaking glass shattered the spell of their disbelief. The dark red wine splashed violently across her expensive black morning shoes, looking exactly like the blood she had been so willing to spill. She realized in that terrible frozen second that the hospital room in Vancouver was a proven impossible lie. She realized that the wooden urn sitting on the coffee table was a useless, embarrassing prop. She realized that I had known absolutely everything from the very beginning. Total visceral panic seized her body. Patricia did not scream or try to explain her actions. The primal, terrifying instinct of a cornered animal took over her mind completely. She lunged off the sofa, abandoning her son and her daughter-in-law without a single backwards glance. She scrambled over the broken crystal glass and bolted frantically toward the front door of the house. Her breathing was ragged and loud, filling the quiet foyer with the pathetic sounds of a desperate fugitive. She slammed her hands against the heavy wooden door, grabbing the brass handle and yanking it downwards with all her strength. She pulled and pulled frantically, twisting the metal, but the door did not budge a single millimeter. It was locked solidly from the outside with a heavy tactical deadbolt she had not noticed when they proudly marched inside. She beat her fists against the solid wood, whimpering in absolute terror, realizing she was completely trapped inside the very house she had just tried to steal. As Patricia slumped, defeated and shaking against the locked front door, a slow, deliberate sound echoed from the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. It was the heavy, synchronized sound of tactical boots stepping onto the hardwood floor. Cameron and Vanessa spun around on the sofa, completely paralyzed by fear, as the shadows of the hallway shifted into the light. Detective Gibson stepped out into the warm, ambient glow of the living room. His face was a mask of cold, absolute professional fury. He was not alone. Behind him, a squad of 5 fully uniformed police officers filed into the room, fanning out silently to completely block any possible avenue of escape. They had been standing quietly in the absolute darkness of my kitchen the entire time. They had listened to every single arrogant boast and every single confessed threat my son had just delivered. The officers did not draw their weapons, but their hands rested heavily on their utility belts, projecting an aura of absolute inescapable authority. The magnificent trap I had spent the entire day building had just violently and perfectly snapped shut around them. I watched the heavy silence in the living room suffocate the remaining air. Detective Gibson stepped fully into the warm, ambient glow of the room. His eyes locked onto the 3 terrified individuals frozen before him. He did not yell or brandish a weapon. He simply nodded to his officers. The uniformed men moved forward with swift, practiced efficiency. They grabbed Cameron by the shoulders forcefully, spinning him around to face the wall. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs tightening around his wrists echoed sharply through the quiet house. Vanessa tried to stumble backward, but a female officer caught her arms, pulling them firmly behind her back and securing them tightly. Patricia, still slumped against the locked front door, offered no physical resistance as an officer pulled her to her feet and locked the heavy metal cuffs around her pale wrists. Detective Gibson stood in the center of my living room and began reciting their Miranda rights with a slow, deliberate cadence. His voice was a low, steady rumble that commanded absolute attention. He informed them that they had the right to remain silent, a right they had already spectacularly forfeited just moments ago. He methodically listed the specific charges they were facing, letting each individual crime hang in the air. He formally charged them with severe elder abuse, grand larceny, international wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Hearing those specific, monumental charges spoken aloud by a high-ranking police official finally shattered the last remaining illusions they harbored. They were not walking out of this house. They were going to a federal penitentiary. I observed my son, my wife, and my daughter-in-law standing in my living room, bound in steel chains and wearing their immaculate pitch-black mourning clothes. The absolute absurdity of their theatrical grief was staggering. They had dressed themselves for a funeral, completely unaware that it was their own lives they were burying tonight. I walked slowly around the glass coffee table, my eyes dropping to the polished mahogany urn sitting perfectly in the center, the sacred vessel that supposedly held the remains of Patricia's father, the physical prop they had used to manipulate my emotions and orchestrate the final theft of my home. I reached out and picked up the heavy wooden urn. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless gasp from across the room. She was terrified, perhaps thinking I was about to assault her with the heavy wooden box, but I simply held the polished mahogany in my hands, feeling the cold, smooth surface. I looked directly at my wife, letting her see the absolute void where my love for her used to reside. I slowly tilted the urn forward, angling the wide opening toward the hardwood floor. The contents did not drift out like fine, delicate powder. The heavy, granular substance poured out in a thick, dusty cascade. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull, abrasive scratching sound, mixing horribly with the dark red wine Patricia had spilled earlier. It piled into an ugly gray mound at my feet. It was not human ash. It was cheap, coarse, heavily perfumed cat litter. The sickening, sweet smell of the artificial deodorizer filled the air, providing the ultimate pathetic sensory metaphor for their entire existence. Their grief was fake. Their tears were fake. The ashes they wept over were bought in a plastic bag from a local grocery store. The visual impact of the spilled cat litter that broke the very last thread holding their criminal alliance together. The illusion of family loyalty disintegrated instantly under the crushing pressure of decades behind bars. Vanessa was the very first to break. The haughty, arrogant woman who had openly mocked my furniture just moments ago collapsed into a puddle of hysterical, self-serving panic. She dropped to her knees, or at least as far down as the officers holding her arms would allow, and began weeping uncontrollably. She screamed to Detective Gibson that she had absolutely no idea about the hidden concrete cell in the basement. She shrieked that she genuinely thought Leonard was in a luxury medical clinic in Canada. Vanessa aggressively turned her head toward Cameron, her face twisted in pure desperate survival instinct. She completely sacrificed her husband without a single moment of hesitation. She wailed to the police that Cameron handled all the finances and that Cameron was the one who built the fake walls. She claimed she was just an innocent, trusting wife who had been maliciously lied to by her own husband. She begged the officers to let her go, promising to testify to everything Cameron had ever done in exchange for her own freedom. She threw the man she married directly into the fire, hoping to shield herself from the flames. Cameron, listening to his wife loudly volunteer to be the prosecution's star witness against him, lost whatever shred of sanity he had left. The color rushed back into his face in a furious dark red flush. He realized he was standing completely alone on a sinking ship, and his immediate instinct was to find a bigger target for the police to focus on. He violently twisted against the grip of the officers holding him and turned his furious gaze entirely upon his own mother. Cameron screamed that Vanessa was a liar, but more importantly, he screamed that he was not the mastermind of this operation. He aggressively pointed his cuffed hands toward Patricia. He yelled to Detective Gibson that his mother was the sole architect of the entire Canadian medical clinic deception. He confessed loudly and freely that Patricia was the one who forged the complex home equity documents because she was the only one who could perfectly replicate my handwriting. He shouted that she was the one who ruthlessly planned the financial drain and that he merely followed her strict instructions because she promised him a massive share of the stolen wealth to save his failing real estate business. He reduced his own mother to the role of a criminal kingpin, frantically trying to paint himself as a manipulated, desperate pawn who was just following a parent's orders. Patricia shoved against the front door and, listening to her only son aggressively volunteer to send her to prison for the rest of her natural life, completely snapped. The calculated, icy demeanor of the sophisticated thief melted away into a display of absolute unhinged ferocity. Her eyes widened with maniacal rage. She screamed back at Cameron, calling him an ungrateful, pathetic failure who could not even run a simple real estate project without begging her to steal from her own husband to bail him out. But Patricia did not stop at simple insults. In her blinding fury, she revealed her ultimate insurance policy. She screamed to the entire room, ensuring every single police officer heard her words perfectly clearly. She announced that she never trusted Cameron to keep his mouth shut if the authorities ever got involved. She confessed loudly and proudly that she had secretly hidden a motion-activated camera in the basement ceiling 6 months ago. She shrieked that she possessed high-definition time-stamped video footage of Cameron physically purchasing, drilling, and installing the heavy-duty industrial padlocks onto the steel door of the concrete cell. She bragged to the detectives that she had kept the digital memory cards hidden in a safe deposit box to ensure that Cameron could never successfully frame her for the physical imprisonment of her father. She was actively providing the police with the exact location of irrefutable hard video evidence of my son committing aggravated kidnapping and false imprisonment. She was enthusiastically handing the prosecution the very nails for her own son's coffin, simply out of spite and sheer vindictive rage. The three of them stood in my living room, bound in steel, loudly and aggressively destroying each other. They were practically fighting over who could confess to the most crimes in their desperate, pathetic attempts to drag the others down with them. Detective Gibson and his officers did not try to silence them. They stood perfectly still, letting the body cameras on their uniforms capture every single freely volunteered confession, every accusation, and every revelation of hidden evidence. The police were watching a highly organized criminal syndicate dismantle itself from the inside out in real time. I stood quietly near the spilled mound of gray cat litter, watching the absolute destruction of my bloodline. There was no sadness left in my heart. There was no grief for the family I was losing. I realized that I had not lost a family today. I had simply exterminated a parasitic infection that had been quietly feeding on my life for decades. The people screaming and tearing each other apart in my foyer were strangers driven by nothing but boundless greed and self-preservation. The magnificent trap I had laid had done its job flawlessly, leaving nothing behind but the bitter, toxic ashes of their enormous lie. The echoing shouts of my family tearing each other apart were suddenly interrupted by the heavy rhythmic sound of footsteps approaching from the front porch. The heavy oak door swung wide open, and the cool evening breeze swept into the stifling foyer. Vincent Foster stepped over the threshold. He looked absolutely immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit, moving with the calm, predatory grace of a corporate shark entering a pool of bleeding fish. He completely ignored the spilled wine, the gray cat litter, and the three handcuffed criminals screaming at each other. Tucked securely under his right arm was an enormously thick, leather-bound legal binder. The mere sight of him silenced the room instantly. Even Detective Gibson stepped back slightly, allowing the forensic auditor enough space to operate. Vincent did not look at me. He looked directly at my son. Vincent walked over to the glass coffee table and let the massive legal binder drop onto the surface with a loud, definitive thud. The sound made Cameron physically flinch. Vincent unbuttoned his suit jacket, slowly maintaining an aura of absolute control, and turned his piercing gaze toward the three people standing in chains. He announced to the room that the criminal charges filed by the police were only the beginning of their nightmare. He stated clearly that he was representing my private financial interests, and that he was there to personally serve them with immediate aggressive asset forfeiture documents. Cameron let out a desperate, hollow laugh, trying to project a confidence he no longer possessed. He sneered at Vincent, claiming that his real estate development firm was an independent corporate entity entirely shielded from personal legal disputes. He boasted loudly that his luxury condo project was protected by airtight corporate firewalls, and that neither his father nor any auditor could touch a single brick of his company. He actually puffed out his chest, believing his fraudulent empire was safe from my reach. Vincent smiled. It was not a warm or friendly expression. It was the terrifying smile of an executioner, verifying a condemned man's identity. Vincent reached into the thick binder and pulled out a stack of heavily stamped, notarized financial contracts. He held the papers up to the light, so Cameron could clearly see the crisp federal seals and the bold corporate letterheads. Vincent explained with chilling precision that he had spent the entire afternoon diving into the toxic, rotting financial architecture of Cameron's development firm. He detailed how the company was effectively bankrupt, drowning in defaulted loans, contractor liens, and desperate private financing. Then Vincent delivered the fatal blow. He explained that corporate debt is a tradable commodity. When a company is failing spectacularly, their desperate lenders are often more than happy to sell off that toxic debt for pennies on the dollar just to recoup a fraction of their losses. Vincent looked my son dead in the eyes and revealed that roughly 3 hours ago, acting under my explicit instructions and utilizing my heavily fortified private wealth, he had aggressively contacted every single one of Cameron's primary creditors. He legally purchased every defaulted loan, every outstanding lien, and every private financial note attached to the real estate development firm. The color drained from Cameron's face as the monumental reality of the financial maneuver crashed into his brain. Vincent laid the documents down on the glass table, smoothing them out perfectly. He officially informed my son that Warren Hoffman was no longer just his betrayed father. Warren Hoffman was now the sole primary creditor and the absolute majority debt holder of his entire corporate existence. Because the loans were deeply in default, and Cameron had violated dozens of fiduciary covenants by laundering money through fake medical clinics, I now possessed the absolute legal right to instantly call in the debt in full. Cameron began to shake his breath, coming in shallow, rapid gasps. He realized he was not protected by a corporate shield. He realized I owned the shield, and I was actively crushing him with it. Vincent relentlessly continued his legal execution. He stated that because Cameron obviously lacked the millions of dollars in liquid capital required to satisfy the instantly matured debt, the forfeiture clauses were automatically triggered. Vincent announced that effective immediately, my legal team was aggressively liquidating the entire company. We were seizing the corporate bank accounts. We were liquidating the luxury condo development. But the financial clawback did not stop at the corporate level. Because Cameron and Vanessa had foolishly tied their personal assets to the company to secure their fraudulent loans, their personal lives were now completely legally exposed. Vincent informed them that their luxury high-rise apartment, the one they paid for using the blood and suffering of Patricia's father, was currently being seized by the bank. They had exactly 0 properties to their names. Every single dime they thought they possessed was completely frozen, locked behind federal holds and aggressive corporate litigation. They were entirely destitute. As if on cue, a loud mechanical grinding noise echoed from the street outside my living room window. Heavy amber flashing lights painted the walls of my house, sweeping across the terrified faces of my family. Vanessa stretched her neck, trying to look through the large front windows. A massive, heavy-duty tow truck had just reversed aggressively into my driveway. 2 men in high-visibility vests leaped out of the truck and began unspooling thick steel cables. They were walking directly toward the sleek black Porsche that Vanessa had parked arrogantly on my property just an hour earlier. Vincent checked his expensive wristwatch and casually mentioned that the vehicle repossession teams were highly efficient this time of night. Since the luxury cars were leased under the newly liquidated corporate entity, they were officially being repossessed to satisfy a microscopic fraction of the massive debt Cameron owed me. Vanessa watched through the window as the heavy steel hooks clamped onto the axles of the expensive sports car she loved to flaunt. The hydraulic winch whined loudly, dragging the beautiful vehicle up onto the flatbed of the tow truck. The physical sight of her extreme wealth being literally dragged away into the night completely shattered her remaining composure. The absolute gravity, her new reality, finally sank into her mind. She was going to jail. She was completely broke. She had no home, no car, and no future. She dropped heavily to her knees on the hardwood floor, the steel handcuffs pulling sharply against her wrists. She looked up at me, her perfectly applied makeup now a ruined, chaotic mess of dark streaks and terrified tears. All of her previous arrogance, her mocking cruelty, and her untouchable vanity had vanished completely. She was reduced to a pathetic weeping shell. She crawled forward on her knees, stopping just inches from my shoes, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. She begged me. She sobbed uncontrollably, pleading for mercy, telling me that she was terrified of going to a federal prison. She cried that she needed legal representation, but all of her accounts were frozen and her credit cards were destroyed. She looked up at the man she had threatened to lock in a nursing home just a few hours prior and begged for a loan. She pleaded for a mere $5,000, just enough cash to hire a basic criminal defense attorney to keep her from being thrown into the general population of the county jail. She swore she would pay me back. She swore she would do anything I asked. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping woman kneeling on my floor. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I felt the cold, clean emptiness of absolute closure. I slowly reached into the pocket of my trousers. I felt the smooth, cool metal of the loose change I kept there. I pulled my hand out and looked down at her tear-stained face. I told her that I was a generous man and that I would absolutely provide her with the resources she needed to secure her legal future. I stepped forward and opened my hand. I let a single silver quarter fall from my fingers. The coin hit the hardwood floor with a sharp metallic clink, bouncing once before rolling slowly toward her knees, coming to a rest right next to the spilled gray cat litter. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her to use that quarter to call a public defender from the county lockup. I advised her to make the call quickly before the jail payphones got too crowded. I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing hysterically on the floor as the officers finally stepped forward to drag them all out into the cold, unforgiving night. Exactly 7 days passed since the police cruisers towed my family away into the dark. I spent that entire week quietly reclaiming my home, throwing away the final lingering traces of the people who tried to bury me alive. The house was finally silent, scrubbed clean of their toxic presence, but there was one final string left to cut. I drove my truck through the bleak industrial outskirts of the city until the towering concrete walls and razor wire of the county correctional facility loomed into view under the gray morning sky. Patricia had used her one daily phone call to desperately contact my attorney, begging for a face-to-face meeting. She had been sitting in a maximum security holding cell denied access to her imported makeup, her designer clothes, and her towering illusions of grandeur. The judge had set her bail at a staggering $1 million, a direct reflection of the severe flight risk she posed and the incredibly heinous nature of her crimes. Walking through the sterile, heavily fortified security checkpoints of the jail, I felt absolutely no anxiety. The oppressive atmosphere, the echoing clanks of heavy steel doors closing, and the harsh buzzing fluorescent lighting would normally intimidate a man my age. But I felt only a profound, quiet emptiness. I surrendered my personal items, walked through the metal detectors, and was guided down a long, colorless corridor into a narrow visitor booth. The room was divided by a thick, heavily smudged wall of bulletproof plexiglass. I sat down on the uncomfortable metal stool and looked at the heavy black telephone receiver resting on the wall. I knew exactly why she had summoned me to this miserable place. She was completely out of options, out of allies, and utterly stripped of her stolen wealth. She was going to try to play her absolute final card. She was going to try to weaponize the 35 years we spent together to save her own skin. The heavy metal door on the opposite side of the glass clanked open with a loud, reverberating thud. A female correctional officer escorted my wife into the small caged booth. The physical transformation was truly shocking. The arrogant, untouchable woman who had stood proudly in my living room, wearing immaculate mourning clothes, was entirely gone. Patricia was dressed in a faded, oversized orange jumpsuit that swallowed her frame. Her hair, usually styled to absolute perfection, hung flat and gray around her exhausted, unwashed face. The deep, dark circles under her eyes revealed a week of sleepless terror and paralyzing anxiety in the county lockup. When she saw me sitting quietly on the other side of the glass, her eyes immediately welled up with heavy tears. She rushed to the plexiglass, pressing her trembling hands against the thick barrier, as if trying to reach through it, and snatched the heavy black receiver off the wall with desperate urgency. I slowly picked up my receiver and held it to my ear. I did not speak. I simply waited. Patricia wasted no time launching into the performance of her life. Her voice echoed through the earpiece, wet with desperate, ragged sobs. She called me her sweet, loving husband. She begged me to look at her, pleading with me to remember the decades we had spent building a life together. She brought up the early days of our marriage, the financial struggles we overcame, and the beautiful home we had created. She wept loudly into the phone, telling me that the food in the prison was making her physically sick, that the violent inmates terrified her, and that she was absolutely certain she would not survive the stress of a federal trial. She seamlessly transitioned into her ultimate request. She begged me to leverage the house, to borrow heavily against my union pension, to sell my truck, to do absolutely whatever it took to post her $1 million bail. She swore to me, crying hysterically, that if I just got her out of this freezing concrete cage, she would spend the rest of her natural life making it up to me. I listened to her desperate, calculating performance, without moving a single muscle. When she realized that begging for my sympathy was not cracking my resolve, she immediately shifted her tactics. She tried to justify the monstrous things she had done. Patricia lowered her voice, trying to sound incredibly vulnerable and tragically broken. She told me she was terrified. She claimed that watching her father decline had triggered a deep, paralyzing fear of growing old in absolute crushing poverty. She swore she only forged those bank documents and drained his accounts because she was desperately trying to secure our future. She spun a pathetic, twisted narrative where her extreme greed was actually an act of misguided love. She cried into the phone, telling me she was petrified that my small pension would not be enough to sustain us if we ever got seriously sick. She claimed that Cameron had manipulated her fears, convincing her that taking out the massive loan against our house was the only way to generate enough wealth to keep us safe in our twilight years. She painted herself as a frightened, loving wife who made a series of terrible mistakes because she was simply too afraid of dying broke and forgotten. She pressed her tear-stained face against the scratched plexiglass and whispered that everything she did, every lie she told, and every crime she committed was secretly driven by her profound desire to protect me. I let her finish her entire miserable speech. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger, betrayal, or sorrow. The time for shouting had ended the night the police dragged her out of my foyer. I looked at the woman who had happily planned to banish me to a dark, unventilated basement cell just to steal my modest life savings. I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my coat. I pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of heavy watermarked paper. It was a fully certified, heavily notarized statement from my primary wealth management bank, officially verified by Vincent Foster just yesterday. I slowly unfolded the document and pressed the printed side flat against the thick plexiglass, right at her eye level. I watched her eyes dart downward, her brow furrowing in confusion as she tried to read the text through her tears. I kept the receiver pressed to my ear and spoke in a perfectly calm, icy tone. I told her to look very closely at the bottom line of that document. I explained that it was a verified summary of the blind trusts and offshore investment accounts I had maintained since selling a massive software patent long before we were ever married. I watched her lips silently mouth the numbers printed on the page. The total liquid asset valuation was precisely $20,400,000. I spoke softly into the phone, letting every single word land with the devastating weight of a sledgehammer. I told her that she did not need to steal a single penny to secure our future. I told her that if she had simply remained the decent, loving wife she pretended to be, she would have spent the rest of her natural life in unimaginable, bottomless luxury. She would never have wanted for anything. We could have traveled the world. We could have afforded the finest medical care on the planet without forging a single signature or hurting a single soul. I told her that her horrific consuming greed had completely blinded her to the massive fortune she already possessed simply by being married to me. The absolute magnitude of her colossal stupidity struck her like a physical blow. The remaining color drained completely from her exhausted face, leaving her looking like a ghost. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as her brain finally processed the reality of the numbers printed on the glass. She had destroyed her family, orchestrated a kidnapping, and guaranteed herself a life sentence in a federal penitentiary in a desperate, filthy scramble to steal a tiny fraction of what was already legally hers to share. The realization absolutely broke her mind. Patricia dropped the phone receiver. It dangled by its metal cord, swinging gently against the plexiglass. She slid down the wall of the visitor booth, collapsing into a heap on the filthy concrete floor. She began to scream. It was not a scream of fear or manipulation. It was the agonizing, hysterical wail of a human being realizing they had burned their own paradise to the ground for absolutely nothing. I did not stay to watch her weep. I calmly folded my bank statement, slipped it back into my coat pocket, and placed my receiver back onto the metal hook. The line went dead. I turned my back on the glass booth and walked out of the prison, leaving her trapped forever in the hell of her own making. I drove back to Oak Park under a bright, clear morning sky. The air felt lighter, completely scrubbed of the toxic tension that had suffocated me for months. I was not driving alone. Sitting comfortably in the passenger seat of my truck, wrapped in a warm blanket, was Leonard. We did not sneak in through the garage. We did not hide in the shadows. I parked the truck directly in the driveway in broad daylight, and I walked my father-in-law through the front door of the house where he had once been held captive. The transformation of the house was absolute. The day after Patricia's arrest, I had completely gutted the massive first-floor guest suite. I used my hidden wealth to strip out the antique furniture and replace it with state-of-the-art hospital-grade medical equipment. The room was now a bright, airy, and incredibly comfortable sanctuary. It featured an adjustable ergonomic bed, advanced monitoring systems, and large windows that overlooked the peaceful backyard garden. I did not rely on the Canadian clinics my wife had fabricated. I hired a team of elite private round-the-clock nurses paying their premium salaries entirely out of my own pocket. Leonard was finally going to receive the absolute highest standard of care, surrounded by safety and genuine respect. I helped Leonard settle into his new room. He looked around the bright sunlit space, his eyes taking in the medical monitors, the comfortable seating area for the nurses, and the vase of fresh flowers on the nightstand. He looked at me, his expression a profound mixture of deep exhaustion and immense quiet gratitude. He did not need to say thank you. The absolute relief radiating from his face was enough. Later that afternoon, Vincent Foster arrived at the house. He walked into Leonard's suite carrying a sleek leather briefcase, moving with his usual precise professional efficiency. Leonard was sitting up in his adjustable bed, looking sharper and more alert than he had in years. The forced malnutrition and isolation had taken a severe physical toll, but his mind was completely intact. He knew exactly what he needed to do to permanently sever the final rotting ties to his daughter. Vincent laid out a series of dense, heavily notarized legal documents on the adjustable overbed table. He explained the profound legal consequences of each page with absolute clarity. Leonard did not hesitate for a single second. He took the pen from Vincent and methodically, deliberately signed every single document. With those strokes of ink, he officially, legally, and permanently disinherited Patricia. He stripped her of any future claim to his estate, completely severing her from the wealth she had destroyed her life trying to steal. But Leonard went one massive step further. He did not just cut his daughter out of his will. He looked at me, his eyes shining with absolute, unwavering trust, and formally transferred the entirety of his remaining $4 million estate into a newly formed, ironclad blind trust. The trust was to be managed exclusively by me, with Vincent acting as the independent legal auditor. The mandate of the trust was explicitly clear. Not a single penny of Leonard's money would ever go to Patricia Cameron or Vanessa. Instead, upon Leonard's eventual passing, the entire $4 million fortune was legally destined to be distributed among specific vetted charities dedicated to protecting vulnerable seniors from domestic and financial abuse. Leonard was using the very wealth that almost killed him to ensure that what happened in my basement could never happen to anyone else. The immense satisfaction of that moment, the absolute undeniable victory over their monstrous greed, was a quiet, settling peace. Vincent packed up his briefcase, shook Leonard's hand with profound respect, and left the house to formally file the documents with the federal courts. I sat in the armchair next to Leonard's bed, listening to the quiet, reassuring hum of the medical monitors. We had won. The war was officially over. But the silence in the house was abruptly shattered by the harsh, vibrating buzz of my cell phone resting on the kitchen counter. I walked out of the guest suite and picked up the device. The caller ID did not display a name. It displayed a generic automated toll-free number. I accepted the call, and an emotionless, automated voice filled the speaker. It informed me that I was receiving a collect call from an inmate at the state correctional facility. The automated system asked if I would accept the charges. I stood in the quiet, sunlit kitchen staring at the polished granite countertops. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. The absolute crushing reality of his situation must have finally broken his arrogant facade. I pressed the button to accept the call. "Dad." The voice on the other end gasped. It was Cameron. He was weeping hysterically, his voice ragged and thick with panic. The confident, smug real estate developer who had bragged about the soundproofing of his torture cell was completely gone. He sounded like a terrified, desperate child crying in the dark. "Dad, please, you have to help me," he sobbed violently into the receiver. "They were going to kill me, Dad. You have to send the money. Please, I'm begging you." I did not speak. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the chaotic, echoing background noise of the state penitentiary. I could hear the harsh metallic clanging of cell doors and the distant aggressive shouts of other inmates. Cameron was absolutely frantic. He stammered out a pathetic, terrifying confession. The dangerous, unofficial lenders that my private investigator had warned me about had reached inside the prison walls. Cameron owed massive, toxic gambling debts to men who did not care that his bank accounts were frozen or that his company was liquidated. They had found him in the general population. Cameron wept, his breath coming in sharp, agonizing gasps. He told me that he had already been severely beaten in the recreation yard. He claimed his ribs were broken and his eye was swollen shut. He sobbed that the inmates controlling his debt had given him a strict, non-negotiable deadline. He needed to pay $50,000 in protection money by the end of the week. They had explicitly promised to end his life. He was begging his father, the man he had tried to ruin, the man he had planned to lock in an unventilated basement, to wire $50,000 to a specific commissary account to save him from being murdered in a prison shower. The absolute breathtaking irony of his demand echoed through the quiet kitchen. He was begging for the exact same amount of money that Vanessa had aggressively demanded I wire to her fake medical clinic just days ago. He was trapped in a concrete cell, terrified for his life, desperately praying that the father he had so callously discarded would swoop in and rescue him from the horrific consequences of his own actions. He was completely out of options, out of leverage, and entirely at my mercy. I stood in the center of my sunlit kitchen and listened to the ragged weeping of the man I had raised. The heavy plastic of the phone receiver felt entirely foreign in my hand. Through the small speaker, I could hear the terrifying symphony of a state penitentiary. There were the echoing shouts of violent men, the harsh metallic slamming of steel gates, and the underlying hum of absolute despair. Above all of that noise was the sound of my son begging for his life. He choked on his tears, completely stripped of the arrogant vanity that had defined his entire adult existence. He pleaded with me to wire the $50,000 to his commissary account. He swore that he would be a better man, that he would find a way to repay every single cent he had stolen, that he would dedicate the rest of his miserable life to earning my forgiveness. He promised me the world if I would just save him from the brutal beating he was scheduled to receive before the weekend. I did not interrupt him. I let him pour every ounce of his pathetic desperation into the phone line. I listened to his frantic breathing and realized with a profound sense of finality that I felt absolutely nothing. There was no fatherly urge to protect him. There was no lingering trace of parental guilt. The space in my chest where my love for him used to reside was completely hollowed out and swept clean. I was simply listening to a stranger facing the inevitable harvest of the toxic seeds he had spent his entire life planting. When his sobbing finally began to slow down into breathless hiccups, he waited for my response. He waited for the soft, comforting tone I had always used when he scraped his knee as a child or when he failed a college exam. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath of the quiet suburban air circulating through my pristine kitchen. I spoke to him in a voice that carried no anger and no malice, but only the freezing temperature of an absolute and permanent conclusion. I told him that I was not going to send a single dollar to the prison. I heard a sharp intake of breath on his end, but I did not stop speaking. I reminded him of the horrific concrete tomb he had spent weeks building directly beneath the floorboards of my home. I painted a vivid picture of the heavy-duty drywall he had installed to muffle the cries of a starving old man. I reminded him of the 4 industrial padlocks he had physically purchased and secured to that steel door. I asked him if he had felt even a single microscopic ounce of pity when he locked his own grandfather in the pitch-black cold to slowly rot away in his own waste. I told him that he had engineered a masterpiece of human suffering entirely for his own financial gain, without a moment of hesitation. I explained that the universe has a very precise way of balancing the scales, and that he was currently standing exactly where he deserved to be. Cameron began to wail again, begging me not to leave him to die among violent criminals. I ignored his cries completely. I told him that just 2 days ago, a professional cleaning crew had come to the house. I explained that they had completely dismantled the fake walls and torn out the heavy steel door he was so incredibly proud of. I told him that the basement was now just a massive empty storage space. The concrete was scrubbed clean, and the air was fresh and circulating again. I told him that the empty basement was the perfect physical representation of his future. He had no company left to manage. He had no luxury condominium to return to. He had no beautiful wife waiting to support him because she was actively testifying against him to reduce her own sentence. His entire existence had been reduced to a barren, empty void. I advised him to stop begging for a rescue that was never going to come. I told him to look around his concrete cell and get very comfortable behind the heavy steel bars. I suggested that he use the remaining decades of his life sentence to reflect on the craftsmanship of the padlocks, keeping him inside because he was the one who had fundamentally designed his own absolute destruction. He screamed my name through the phone, his voice cracking with a terrifying primal panic as he finally realized that his manipulation tactics were completely useless. He knew in that exact moment that he was entirely alone in a dark and violent world. I did not offer a final goodbye. I did not wish him well or tell him that I would pray for his soul. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear. I listened to the faint, tinny sound of his screaming fading away as I lowered my arm. I pressed the red button to disconnect the call. The silence that instantly flooded my kitchen was magnificent. It was a thick, beautiful silence that washed over me like a cleansing rain. I opened the security settings on my cellular provider application. I navigated to the incoming call log and selected the designated toll-free number of the state correctional facility. I tapped the screen to permanently block the number, ensuring that not a single phone call from that prison would ever reach my home again. The connection was permanently severed. I placed the phone face down on the cool granite countertop and walked away. I walked slowly through the quiet, peaceful hallways of my home. Every room I passed was filled with warm, natural light and the comforting scent of fresh linen. There were no secrets hiding behind closed doors. There were no manipulative whispers echoing through the ventilation shafts. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had crushed my spirit for so many months was entirely gone. I opened the glass sliding door and stepped out onto the wide wooden back porch. The afternoon sun was warm and brilliant, casting golden rays across the manicured green lawn. The gentle rustling of the wind passing through the oak trees sounded like a quiet victory song. Sitting at the patio table looking out over the vibrant garden was Leonard. He was wearing a comfortable knitted sweater and holding a warm ceramic mug of fresh coffee. The color had returned to his cheeks, and his eyes were bright and peaceful. He took a slow sip of his coffee and looked up at me with a soft, genuine smile of greeting. He did not need to ask who had called. He saw the profound, settling peace radiating from my posture. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I rested my arms on the table and took a long, incredibly deep breath of the fresh suburban air. I looked up at the endless blue sky above my property, knowing that the predators who had sought to consume my life and destroy my family were gone forever. They were locked away in cages of their own making, and I was finally completely free. The most profound lesson we can extract from Warren's harrowing journey is that true family is defined by mutual respect, loyalty, and empathy, never merely by shared bloodlines or legal obligations. Kindness, when offered blindly to those who view it as a weakness to be exploited, inevitably becomes an instrument of your own destruction. Warren teaches us that establishing absolute, unbreakable boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but an essential act of self-preservation. Ultimately, the greatest demonstration of self-love is finding the courage to completely walk away from those who insist on causing you harm. If Warren's relentless pursuit of justice resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of individuals taking back their lives.